So the D.C. Bar Association filed a complaint against Jeffrey Clark, the disgraced lawyer from the Justice Department who helped Donald Trump assert his claims that he had actually won the election even though he'd lost it. Claims otherwise known as the Big Lie. But is this action just too little too late? Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So like many of you, I've been sitting here getting frustrated watching the Trump apologists getting away with slaps on their wrist for behavior that was nothing short of undermining democracy. And as an attorney, I'm particularly bothered by the number of lawyers who were involved in these efforts to undermine democracy. After all, and I know this sounds counterintuitive to many people out there, but we lawyers are actually governed by a code of ethics. And that code of ethics actually is strongly enforced. I can tell you that I personally know a number of lawyers who've been called to account for certain behavior that they've taken in court or out of court. Because as attorneys, we are held to a higher standard. Let me start with one obvious example here, by the way, which is number one, we can't lie in court. Despite the claims that lawyers lie all the time, lying in court is actually something that lawyers can lose their license for. And what's more is you can't even make assertions in court that don't have some kind of factual basis. In other words, you can't just say, I think something is true. You have to have some reason to believe that something is true. And if you can't somehow show clear evidence for the fact that you had some basis for this belief, then courts will discipline you for that. We saw that happen here in Michigan, where a federal judge fined Lynn Wood and Sidney Powell for making allegations here in court that the judge found did not have a factual basis. Those allegations, of course, were that there was widespread voter fraud that somehow denied Donald Trump the presidency. U.S. District Judge Linda Parker ordered them to pay over $175,000 in fines for their Kraken lawsuit, which was found to be without basis. In fact, I love Lynn Wood's response to it, which is that he went ahead and filed this lawsuit without first reading the complaint. That's not the type of behavior that you're going to get away with in front of judges. But what's particularly surprising to me is the silence of so many of these bar associations over this unethical behavior by these lawyers. Let me give you a few examples of the kinds of ethics rules that govern lawyers. According to Rule 3.3 of the Model Code of Professional Ethics, which is followed by most states in the D.C. Bar, a lawyer owes candor to any tribunal he works before. As the rule says, and I quote, a lawyer, quote, shall not knowingly, 1, make a false statement of fact or law to a tribunal or fail to correct a false statement of material fact or law previously made to the tribunal by the lawyer. And for people who claim somehow that making false statements to Congress doesn't count, well, in fact, Rule 3.9 specifically says that representing a client before a legislative body counts when it comes to that rule. What's more is, according to Rule 3.4c, lawyers may not, quote, knowingly disobey an obligation under the rules of a tribunal. So anybody, any lawyer who is refusing to testify before Congress as a result of a subpoena is in violation of that rule. And it's not just in terms of making false statements to the courts that lawyers can get in trouble. After all, Rule 4.1 says that a lawyer, quote, shall not knowingly make a false statement of material fact or law to a third person. So when Bill Barr, for example, made false statements with respect to the Mueller report to the press, that was a violation of that rule. Finally, lawyers take very seriously their responsibility not to have conflicts of interest. I actually had this experience myself when I was in private practice. I represented a couple at one point who filed bankruptcy together, but then as the case proceeded, it turned out that they had differing interests. We had to withdraw from the case and not represent either of them because each of them had given us privileged information which now we couldn't use against the other. They had to go get individually separate attorneys from us. Now this is where it gets interesting. With lawyers like Bill Barr And Jeffrey Clark, for example, government lawyers, they actually represent the government, the people. They do not represent the elected officials who are in charge of the government. So in other words, to the extent that Bill Barr or Jeffrey Clark made efforts to assist Donald Trump in contravention to the interests of the people, they were violating their ethical obligation to steer clear of conflicts of interest. They should have made it clear to Donald Trump that they represented the people, not Donald Trump personally. So when, for example, Donald Trump attacked Jeff Sessions, his first attorney general, stating that he didn't have an attorney general, and I find it ironic here to be defending Jeff Sessions of all people, but Jeff Sessions was right to assert the fact that he didn't represent Donald Trump. He represented the people of the United States of America. Well, as it turns out, there's an organization that's been set up called the 65 Project. And as always, I'll post a link to it down below. But they have filed more than a dozen complaints against Trump lawyers as a result of their ethical violations. In most cases, nothing has been done by any of the bars with respect to these complaints. Some of the lawyers they filed complaints against include Cleta Mitchell, for example, who was on the call when Donald Trump tried to pressure Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find him enough votes to turn the election his way. They filed a complaint against Senator Ted Cruz because, of course, he was the one who was asserting in the Senate that there was some type of issue with the election that should result in the appointment of different electors than were sent from the states. They have filed complaints against a number of false electors who are attorneys, people like Daryl Moody, Andrew Hitt, and William Carver. And they filed one against the insurrectionist attorney, William Calhoun. Now again, in every one of these cases, these are people who are trying to undermine American democracy, something that lawyers are not allowed to do. And as such, these people should face discipline from the bar, potentially even losing their right to practice. Now, I have to give credit to the New York bar. They actually suspended Rudy Giuliani from the practice of law. But Rudy Giuliani was only the most prominent one of a number of attorneys who were assisting Donald Trump in his efforts to subvert the American democracy. And as such, every one of these attorneys needs to be disciplined, because if they aren't, we're going to find in the future that attorneys no longer feel an obligation to stand by our oath, which is to protect and preserve the Constitution of the United States. Well, if you want to check out another video where I explore the nature of treason and whether the Republicans who were trying to undermine our democracy actually engaged in it, check out this video over here. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.